The subject for today, big blocks and boost. In our previous two videos, you need to check those out. We took a Junkyard 454, installed a cam upgrade, then ran it with a Vortex supercharger. Then we installed an intercooler, then we did a head swap. Having done that, it's time for turbos. In this video, we're running twin turbos on our Junkyard 454. If you haven't seen the two previous videos, take a look. Part 1 is right here, and now part 2 is right here. In those videos, we ran a Vortex supercharger on our Junkyard Gen 6 454. Now we ran it without an intercooler, with an intercooler, and then we did a head upgrade. But now I had to remove those Vortex heads and reinstall the factory iron oval port heads. The reason I did this is because I wanted to show what happens if a guy goes to the wrecking yard, grabs one of those motors, adds ring gap. Now we also put in MLS head gaskets and ARP headsets. Always a good idea when you're running a lot of boost. But if you go to the wrecking yard, get that motor, make those upgrades, install a cam and springs, then add boost, here's what happens. In our case, we installed boost from two Borg Warner S475 turbos. And yeah, I know, we went overboard on the turbos. The reality is, with the boost that we ran on this combination, a single S475 would work just fine. The problem is, the hot side on our S475s was a little smaller than I would want to run on a 454. The reason is those turbos were chosen to run as a twin turbo setup on smaller LS motors, and they're not ideally suited for a big 454. In fact, if I was running just a single turbo on our 454 cammed, I probably would choose an S480 T6 with a bigger AR. But why run one turbo when you can go overkill and run two S475s? Besides, having more, always better. Now those two S475 turbos were blowing boost into our dual core air-to-water intercooler from CX Racing. It's the one we used in all the big bang stuff. Now the air Xing that was going to get even more cooling because we were blowing through a dedicated CSU blow-through 850 carburetor. That's right, too much turbo, lots of intercooling, and a blow-through. Charge cooling? Boom, check that off. All of that worked well, but I want to show again. Junkyard, cam upgrade, boost, what happens? Let's take a look. Okay guys, before we get to the results on our twin turbo big block Chevy, I need you to do something for me. All this stuff right down here, push those buttons. Hit the like button, the share button, ring the bell, subscribe. But more than that, I want you guys to go out and tell a friend about it. Now I don't care how you do it. It doesn't have to be these buttons down here. Send a telegram, an email, text message, shoot a flaming arrow, smoke signals, whatever you gotta do. Make sure to help me out, because the more people that watch the video, the crazier the testing I can do. And I got a lot of crazy ideas. Let's get to the results. Before we get started with our turbo combination, I wanted to show you guys the difference between, I get a lot of questions and comments about the EFI testing versus carbureted testing, because a lot of times when we go to the wrecking yard, we will take these things out and take off the factory EFI induction system and put a carbureted dual plane on it. And here's what we pulled one of these from the wrecking yard with the factory EFI and ran it with a Holley EFI system and ran the factory injectors and everything. And here's what the power curves look like. With headers on this thing and an open throttle body, it made 356 horsepower and 485 foot-pounds. And again, we always run these zero electric water pump, no accessories, obviously no air intake, a filter, any of that stuff. We ran it with long tube headers and no exhaust. We also ran it a little colder than the factory and with an optimized timing. And this is as much power as it could make. Basically, we added timing till it stopped making power. We adjusted the air fill till it stopped making power. This is what the EFI version does. And I wanted to show you what happens. Normally we put a carburetor on here. So we put a dual plane, like we'll run a RPM air gap or something on here with the 750 carburetor. And here's the difference in power with a carbureted combination. You can see that the EFI was designed, because it's the blue line, was designed for low speed torque, and that's not surprising. That's what they designed this motor for. So it makes it a little more low speed. The dual plane carburetor makes more power at the top, and that would increase because this is only run to 5,000 RPM. But now let's take a look and see what happened when we ran our combination. After we added our camshaft, we put an extreme energy camshaft in this thing, and a valve spring upgrade on the cylinder heads, because you have to put a valve spring upgrade when you run that camshaft. Here's what happened when we ran our combination with the camshaft upgrade. I'll go ahead and put the cam specs up there so you guys can see it. But as you can see, we lost a little bit down low because this is a healthy camshaft. but we picked up a lot of power at the top. So we're talking about 425, 26, 27 horsepower. You know, they all make within a couple of each other. And peak torque was 476 foot-pounds of torque. This is kind of typical. I've run a lot of these. I bet I've run a dozen of these big block motors like this, and we've done this kind of upgrade. And this is kind of what they do. So we extended the effective RPM range out a little farther. This thing's making peak power at 5,400 RPM, whereas before, when it was stock, it was making peak power at 4,400 RPM. So we shifted it out quite a bit with the camshaft. But now that we've got our combination put together, and again, this is just a carbureted Gen 4 or Gen 6 Junkyard 454 with that Comp Extreme Energy cam, long tube headers, a dual plane intake, RPM air gap in this case, and a 750 Holley. So now let's find out what happens after we install our twin S475 turbos in that blow-through carburetor. This is our carbureted Gen 6 Junkyard 454. Now remember, we also, when we had this thing apart, we increased the ring gap and installed a set of Fel-Pro MLS gaskets and head studs. If you're going to put the MLS gaskets on, it's a good idea to have make sure that the surface finish is appropriate. It's got to be really, really smooth for the MLS gaskets, otherwise sealing is going to be an issue. But we installed those. We did our comp cam upgrade and beehive valve springs, and we were at 427 horsepower and 476 foot-pounds. You'll remember that here's what our camshaft did on the carbureted combination. Pushed it out pretty far, made a lot more power, lost a little bit of low end, but that's kind of the trade-off when you pick camshafts. So here's what happened when we installed our twin turbo setup. And first we started out about 9 pounds of boost. We had two S475 turbos feeding that air-to-water intercooler and then blowing through our CSU blow-through carburetor. And that combination's always worked fairly well. In truth, at this boost level, the blow-through carburetor and the intercooler probably were overkill. Now we ran this on 100 octane race gas back in the day, and it worked good. Probably at this boost level you could get away, especially at this low compression, you could get away with 91 octane. You might have to take a degree or two of timing out of it. But this combination, obviously, you see, was making a lot of power, and we had a nice boost curve with this thing. We had two Turbo Smart wastegates on it controlling this, one for each turbo, and we had perfect control on this thing. As you can see, like, look at the torque curve. It just follows the factory torque curve. The horsepower curve is climbing. It looks nice, and this combination would continue to rev. Now, I get comments once in a while about the turbo stuff, and they want to know if on a turbo motor, does the thing want to make peak power higher than it does NA? And if the boost is consistent, if you have a consistent 8 or 9 pounds, let's say, through the whole curve, the shape of the curve will be the same. You will not make peak power higher, but you can do that if you want. If you have the ability to produce a rising boost curve, like with an electronic wastegate controller, or if you have a wastegate that's too small and you have an artificial rising boost curve, it will make peak power at a higher engine speed than it did NA. Because basically you have an increasing amount of airflow going to it. So that's one way to do it. But like all of these combinations, we didn't just stop there and only run 9 pounds of boost. We went up to 11 pounds. And you can see it did what boost always does. It increased the power output. And then we ran it to put another pound of boost into it, and look, it did exactly what it's supposed to do. And if you're looking down here, I know a lot of guys will make comments about this response part, about that's just us not putting enough heat into it when we did the initial load, because obviously we're starting our load at 3,600 RPM. Now we could start it lower if we wanted, we could do that, but this is one of the things I want to bring up about the dyno, is that if you're doing back-to-back runs on a turbo, you have to make sure that everything is the same. You can make 2 runs, and if you let that motor cool off, and not the motor so much, because that's fairly easy to keep at the same temperature, but if you let heat go out of the turbo, the response rate of the turbo will be less. So it's an interesting scenario. So if you're doing back-to-back testing with turbo stuff, and you want to show exactly what the curves are and exactly what the low speed is and all that stuff, you have to make sure that you have heat in those turbos every time, and you have to have the same amount. So it's a little bit of a chore to do real back-to-back testing on this thing. But as you can see, we're just up and up in power. We're over 800 horsepower. we're 830 horsepower or so. And if we just keep going up in boost, we'll keep picking up at this rate, since this thing makes 425, you know, at a rate of, what's that, maybe around 30 horsepower per pound of boost or something. So it's quite a bit. We could go, like I said, we've gone over 1,000, well into 1,200 horsepower with these stock bottom ends. We know they're capable of doing that. So, but imagine what it would be like to have an 800 horsepower motor with over 800 foot-pounds of torque. Go to the wrecking yard, camshaft, boost, you're on your way. Okay guys, what'd you think about our twin turbo Junkyard 454? And yes, I know, go ahead and make the comments. You didn't run it up high enough. I want to see more power. It's got to make more than 1,000 horsepower. And trust me, I've done that a lot. With a stock bottom end Gen 6 454, we've got over 1,200 horsepower. So we know that there's a lot left. But I didn't do this as an all-out kind of thing. What I wanted to show is if a guy goes to the wrecking yard, gets one of these motors, puts a cam and springs in it, with the iron heads, he can make a lot of power. Because that's a comment I always get. Whenever I run these tests, I usually upgrade to an aluminum head. We always put a camshaft in it, but I upgrade to an aluminum head, and I get the same comment. Hey, how much power will it make with a stock iron head? And now we know. That stock iron oval port head works pretty well, and it makes a lot of power. But here's why I like to run an aluminum head. Two big reasons. First of all, aluminum is going to be less likely to detonate. It provides another safety margin that helps stop detonation compared to an iron head. And of course that assumes the chamber shape and size and stuff and efficiency is about the same. The other thing I like about aluminum head, and you can take a look at the test I did on the Vortec deal where we installed the race ride head, where we replaced the oval port head with the race ride head, even with a much lower compression because the chamber was so much bigger, the race ride head added power. And when you add power, because the head flows better than the oval port head does, you lower the boost, meaning you can make any power level at a lower boost level. So a lower boost, less chance of detonation, and more power at the same boost level, both of which are good. That's why I like to upgrade, but if cost is the major thing, which it is for most of us, the iron head still works great. Come on guys, right down here, you know, get those buttons pushed. I'll keep testing.